Not the peaceful kind. Not the silence of a sleeping city or a quiet forest at dawn. This was the silence of something broken. The kind that sits in the air after a great crash, when everything that was standing has already fallen, and the dust has not yet settled. He opened his eyes slowly. The sky above him was gray, the color of old ash. He was lying on his back on cold, cracked stone. His body ached from his shoulders to his feet. He could feel dried cuts on his arms and a dull, heavy pain in his ribs, as if someone had pressed a stone against his chest while he slept. He sat up. What he saw made him go completely still. Varos Hold, his city, his capital, the heart of everything he had spent 17 years building, was gone. Not damaged, not weakened, gone. The great walls that had stood for generations were nothing but uneven piles of black stone. The towers were toppled. The market streets were buried under rubble and ash. The training grounds where hundreds of young wolves had once trained every morning were now a flat, gray emptiness. Kael did not cry. He did not shout. He sat on that cracked stone for exactly 3 seconds, looking at the ruin of his world. Then he pressed his hand to the ground, pushed himself upright, and stood. He was the Alpha King. He did not stay down. His name was Kael Varos, and before this morning, or whatever morning this was, he had been the most powerful leader in the known world. He had not inherited his position. He had built it. One careful decision at a time, over nearly 2 decades. 17 wolf shifter packs had once answered to his authority. 12 territories had fallen under the protection of his empire. His word had ended disputes. His presence had stopped confrontations before they started. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with black hair threaded through with silver at the temples, and eyes the color of dark amber. There were old scars on his hands, the kind that come from years of real work, not ceremony. He was not the kind of king who sat on a throne and gave orders from a distance. He had always led from the front, and every wolf who served him knew it. Now he stood in the ruins of his capital with a torn robe, one missing boot, and a comlink device so shattered it was nothing more than small pieces of metal and glass in his palm. He dropped it. He did not need it anymore. What he needed was to find out who was still alive. Rate not. He moved through the rubble carefully, reading the wreckage the way a general reads a battlefield. He had spent enough years studying how things fall to understand the shape of what had happened here. This was not an accident. It was not a natural disaster. The damage was too precise, too spread out, too deliberate. Every major structure had been struck: the supply stores, the communication towers, the Great Hall, the pack bond chambers, the places where the invisible threads that connected pack members were strongest. All of it, taken down in one coordinated strike. Someone had planned this. Someone had wanted not just to destroy the city, but to cut every connection at once, to leave every wolf alone, separated, disoriented, to take an empire apart not just physically, but from the inside. Kael filed this information away without letting his face change. He kept walking. He found the boy behind the ruins of a market stall. He was young, perhaps 16 or 17, curled tightly against a collapsed wall, his knees pulled to his chest, his eyes closed. He was dressed in the light training gear of a junior pack member, and there were cuts on his forehead and a bruise spreading across his jaw. But he was breathing. Kael crouched down beside him. "Hey," he said quietly. The boy's eyes flew open. He scrambled back, his whole body going rigid, and then he froze, staring at Kael's face as if he could not believe what he was seeing. "You're alive," the boy breathed. His voice was shaking. "You're actually alive. Everyone said. We thought." "What is your name?" Kael asked. "Dex," the boy swallowed. "Dex Arlen. I was in the 2nd Training Unit, Junior Division. Are you hurt, Dex?" "My shoulder, but I can move." Kael nodded. He looked at the boy's shoulder, pressed 2 fingers gently along the joint, and confirmed it was bruised, not broken. Then he stood and held out his hand. "Get up," he said. "We are leaving." Dex stared at the offered hand for a moment, then he took it. They walked east because east was where the survivor reports had come from, at least according to the fragments of information Kael had pieced together in his mind over the past hour. He had a good memory, always had. He remembered every intelligence briefing, every map, every report, and even without his comlink, Even without his network, his mind was still working. The fallen world outside the capital was not empty. It was scattered. Small groups of people moved through the landscape like broken pieces of a mirror, each one reflecting something of what had existed before, but none of them whole. Kael and Dex walked for most of a day before they encountered the first real threat. There were 12 of them, blocking the road ahead. They were a rogue pack, wolves without a home territory, without leadership, without direction. Their leader was a large man with a scarred face and hard eyes, who called himself Brack. He stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had grown used to being the most powerful person in whatever room he entered. He had never been in a room with Kael Varos. Brack looked at the two of them, a tall man in torn robes and a teenage boy, and smiled slowly. "Empty pockets and nowhere to go," he said. "You two are in the wrong place." Kael said nothing. He simply looked at Brack with those dark amber eyes, calm and steady, and completely without fear, and waited. Something happened to Brack in that moment. The smile faded, the confidence in his shoulders shifted. He had faced down a lot of people in the past weeks, and all of them had shown him something. Fear, anger, defiance. This man showed him nothing, and somehow, nothing was more unsettling than any of those things. "Who are you?" Brack asked, and for the first time, his voice had lost its edge. "Someone who has a better use of your time than this," Kael said simply. He spoke quietly, without aggression, as if they were having a conversation at a table somewhere civilized. "Stand your people down, come with me, or don't. But if you stay in this road, one of us will regret it, and it won't be me." There was a long silence. Two of Brack's wolves exchanged a look. Then, without a word, they stepped away from their group and moved to stand behind Kael. Brack stared. He had just watched two of his own people leave him in under a minute, drawn by nothing more than the way a stranger stood and spoke. He stepped aside and let them pass. "No!" The survivor camp was 3 days east of the capital, and by the time Kael arrived, word had run ahead of him. People stood at the edge of the camp and watched him walk in, with the expression of people seeing something they had been told was impossible. The camp held around 400 wolves from at least 6 different broken packs. They had built rough shelters from whatever they could find. There was food, not enough, but some. There was a woman named Petra, who had taken charge simply because no one else had stepped forward, and she was doing her best with very little. When she saw Kael, she let out a slow breath, as if she had been holding it for weeks. "We didn't know if you were alive," she said. "I am," he replied. "Tell me everything." She told him. He listened without interrupting, without reacting to the difficult parts, without letting his expression show the weight of what he was hearing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he climbed onto a low section of broken wall at the edge of the camp and looked out at the gathered crowd. "I know what you've lost," he said. His voice carried without him needing to raise it. It always had. "I've walked through it. I've seen it. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't real, or that it wasn't terrible. It was. But I will tell you this. What we had before, we built once. That means we can build it again. Not because it is easy, because we know how." He paused. "I'm not asking you to follow a title. I'm asking you to follow a direction. Forward. That is the only one that matters now. If you're with me, then starting tonight, this camp becomes something different. It becomes the beginning." The camp was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to nod. Over the following days, 3 familiar faces appeared from different directions, each of them worn and carrying the marks of difficult weeks. Marin came first. She had been Kael's second-in-command for 9 years, sharp-minded, strategic, able to read a situation in seconds. She arrived at the camp with a small group of 7 survivors she had collected along the way, and when she saw Kael, she stopped walking and just looked at him for a moment. "You look terrible," she said. "I know," he said. "Good. Then you know what the rest of us have been through." She sat down beside him and pulled out a piece of folded paper covered in notes she had been keeping during her journey. They worked through the night. Oren arrived 2 days later, Kael's intelligence officer, the quietest and most observant man Kael had ever known. He had spent weeks alone in the wilderness, gathering information, watching enemy movements, piecing together what had happened from every fragment of evidence he could find. He looked thinner than before, and his eyes carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been alone with difficult information for too long. But his mind was as sharp as ever. He sat across from Kael and Marin and laid out what he had learned. The collapse had been planned for years. It was a coordinated attack by a coalition of groups who had watched Kael's empire grow and decided, quietly and patiently, that they could not allow it to grow further. They had taken their time. They had placed a source close to the inner council, someone trusted, someone who had been there for years. And when the moment came, they had struck everywhere at once. The source was a man named Reth. He had been Kael's Minister of Alliances for 6 years. There was silence at the table when Oren said the name. Kael sat with his hands flat on the table and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Where is he now?" "With them," Oren said, "operating as a liaison in their new structure." Kael nodded once. He stood up, excused himself, walked to the training area at the edge of the camp, and worked alone until his hands hurt. That was the only response he allowed himself. By the next morning, he was back at the table, planning. The healer Sable arrived on the 4th day, and her presence changed something in the camp that was difficult to name. She was not a fighter or a strategist. She was the person who kept people going when their bodies and hearts were giving out. She had served under Kael for 12 years, and she was one of the very few people he had ever allowed to speak plainly to him. When she found him alone one evening, sitting outside the camp's boundary and looking at nothing in particular, she sat down beside him without asking permission and placed her hand briefly against his chest, over a scar from a battle they had both survived years before. He closed his eyes, just for one breath. "How are you really?" she asked. "Moving forward," he said. "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly he said, "I keep thinking about the ones we didn't find." Sable didn't offer any words to make it better. She simply stayed beside him until he was ready to stand. That was what she always did, and it was always enough. The rebuilding was not romantic. It was not a story of glory rising easily from the ashes. It was weeks of hard, unglamorous work. Kael assigned roles based on what people were actually good at, not what they had done before. He built a food system where everyone received their share, and no single group controlled the supply. He established a simple set of rules, 10 of them, written on a board at the center of camp, that applied equally to everyone, including himself. He organized defense rotations, morning training sessions, communication runs between survivor groups, and nightly briefings where anyone who wanted to attend could hear exactly what was being planned and why. He slept 4 hours a night. He ate last, after everyone else had their portion. When disputes arose, and they did, constantly, between people under pressure, he sat with both sides and listened before speaking. He never shouted. He never needed to. More people came. Word had a way of spreading, even in a broken world. A survivor camp with actual structure, actual food distribution, actual safety. That was something worth walking toward. By the end of the 3rd week, the camp held over 1,000 people from 9 different former packs. Among the arrivals was a man named Voss, alpha of a large, formerly rival pack. He arrived with 200 wolves and the energy of someone who was not interested in following anyone. He sat across from Kael and made clear, without being impolite, that he did not automatically accept Kael's authority just because of who Kael had been before. Kael did not argue with him. Instead, he invited Voss to sit for an hour and talk. The two of them went through the practical realities of the situation. What resources existed, what threats were coming, what each group could contribute, what each group needed. By the end of the hour, Voss had not pledged loyalty, but he had agreed to stay. He had agreed to work within the structure, and he had agreed to attend the next planning meeting. That, Kael understood, was the beginning of everything. The enemy did not wait long. Word reached Kael through Oren's rebuilt intelligence network, a small but fast system of runners and signal fires, that a military force was moving toward the settlement. It was significantly larger than anything Kael currently commanded. They had perhaps 4 days. He called his inner circle together that night and laid out the situation clearly, without softening it. Then he told them what they were going to do. They were not going to fight the battle the enemy expected. They were going to change what battle was being fought. Over 3 days, Kael led a series of small, precisely planned operations against the advancing force, striking at supply lines, using the terrain to slow their movement, sending small, fast groups to flank their outer positions and create confusion. He did not try to match their numbers head-on. He never had. The point was not to overpower them. The point was to make the cost of continuing too high to be worth it. He was on the ground for all of it. His people could see him, which meant they could do things they might not have been able to do alone. 3 wolves died during those 3 days. Kael knew all of their names. That night, alone, he said each name aloud once. He did not move on from it quickly. He let it sit with him for the full weight of what it was. Then he went back to work. The enemy force withdrew. Not broken, but pulled back, recalculating. They had not expected what they encountered. They had expected a desperate group of survivors. They had found something beginning to look like an army with a general. Reth was captured by accident, in the confusion of the final day's operations. He was brought to Kael by 2 young wolves who did not fully understand who they were presenting. Kael was alone with him for 20 minutes before anyone else entered the room. What passed between them in those 20 minutes was mostly listening. Kael asked Reth why, not with anger, but with the genuine need to understand. Understanding was always more useful than rage. Reth gave his answers. They were complicated, as most human reasons are. He had convinced himself, over years, that the empire had grown too powerful, that unchecked, it would eventually become something harmful, that what he did was a form of correction. Kael listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "You could have said any of that to me. Any of it. In 9 years of working beside me, you never tried." Reth had no answer for that. What happened afterward was not revenge. Kael handed Reth to the newly formed council, a group of 11 representatives that Kael had established in the previous days, and let the process of accountability run through a system, not through his personal anger. He understood something important. How a new civilization handles its first great betrayal becomes the standard for everything that follows. He was not going to let that standard be set by emotion. The council held 11 seats. Kael had designed it carefully. Pack leaders, healers, intelligence officers, civilian representatives. Voss held 1 seat. Marin held another. 2 seats were held by ordinary wolves, with no political background at all, a decision that confused some people and was quietly approved of by most. When Marin asked him why he had built it that way, with so many voices instead of one clear authority, he told her the truth. "The old way built something I could protect as long as I was standing," he said. "I need to build something that stands without me." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded and went back to work. On the morning of the 60th day, Kael stood on a rebuilt platform at the center of what had begun as a refugee camp, and was now a functioning settlement of over 2,000 wolves. There were structures going up around them. Not grand, not finished, but real. There were cooking fires and training grounds, and a school that Sable had quietly organized without anyone asking her to. There were arguments and disagreements and problems to solve every single day. There were also mornings like this one, where the air was clear and the people gathered not out of fear, but out of something else. Kael did not give a long speech. He never had liked long speeches. He stood before his people and told them what they had done. He named the days that had been hardest. He named the people who had been lost. He told them the name of what they were building, Varos Reborn. And he explained, plainly, that the name was not about putting the old world back together. It was about carrying forward the parts worth keeping and leaving the rest in the ash where it belonged. When he finished, no one bowed. No one performed ceremony. Instead, one by one, the people gathered in that square raised their right fists. A gesture from the old world that meant something simple. "I stand with you." Kael raised his fist in return. He looked out at the faces of 2,000 people who had survived the end of one world and were choosing, deliberately, to build the next one. He thought of all the names he had said aloud in the dark. He thought of the 3 seconds he had spent on the cold stone before standing up. He did not feel like a king in that moment. He felt like a person who had been given a second chance to do something right. He intended to take it. Wolves moved through the streets below. carrying materials, calling out to each other, arguing over plans. It looked like a beginning. It sounded like one too. Marin entered and placed 3 reports on his desk. 2 new packs had sent representatives, asking to join the settlement. A delegation from a territory that had once been hostile to him was sending an envoy to open talks. Someone, somewhere, was quietly forging the old royal seal, possibly to sell, possibly to use as a challenge. All 3 situations needed attention. He picked up a pen. He had learned something in the 60 days since he woke up in the ash, something he had perhaps always known but never tested this severely. Power is not something you are given. It is not something you are born into or handed by history. It is something you rebuild, choice by choice, day by day, from whatever material the world leaves you with after it has done its worst. The throne he was building now looked nothing like the one he had lost. It had no gold, no ceremony, no grand hall. It was made of decisions, thousands of small ones and a handful of enormous ones, each of them carrying the full weight of what came after. He was not finished. He would not be finished for a very long time, but he was no longer the king of a fallen world. He was the king of a rising one, and he picked up his pen and began.